Well, when it comes to understanding sin, a question that's often asked is, are there various degrees of sin? I mean, most of us recognize that we're not perfect. We've probably sinned some in our life, but come on, it seems like some people are sure a lot worse than others. And so the question is all sin the same in God's eyes, or really are some sins worse than others? And maybe a question that sort of goes along with that is, well, do big sinners and little sinners experience the same punishment? I mean, really, is the nice guy down the street who tells a few white lies really going to be punished in the same way that Hitler is going to be punished? So really, what does the Bible say? Are there different degrees of sin? Well, the Bible does indicate that there are actually varying degrees of sin. Jesus himself actually talked about this. Look what it says in John chapter 19, verse 11. Jesus is talking about the people who had a hand in his death, and when he speaks to Pilate, he says this, "You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." So right here, Jesus seems to indicate that some sin is worse than others. I mean, he says that the people that handed him over to death were committing a greater sin. So Jesus seems to indicate that yes, there are greater sins and lesser sins. But what does that really mean in practical life? Well, here's a couple things to consider. First, understand this, that some sins have greater earthly consequences. Certainly some sins, because of their dramatic nature, are going to affect our lives far more negatively than lesser sins. The book of Proverbs says this in Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 15. It says, "Good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard." It says right there that if you live a life of unfaithfulness or a life of sin, your way is going to be hard. Your life is going to be more difficult, because the Bible also says in the New Testament that we reap what we sow, and that if we continually reap sin into our life, we're going to sow the consequences of that. And so yes, as we go through life, when we sin, we're going to experience consequence, and the greater sin that we commit, the greater consequence that we're going to experience. But also we see that some sins have greater eternal consequences, not just earthly consequences, but eternal consequences. Look again at what Jesus says in Mark chapter 12 and verse 40. Speaking about the Pharisees, it says, "Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property, and then pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. Because of this, they will be more severely punished." Speaking to these hypocritical religious leaders, Jesus says that they're going to experience a greater severity of punishment because of the depth of their sin. And then when you come to the end of the Bible, to the book of Revelation, we see this great picture of the judgment seat, where all those who have not been forgiven of their sin are standing before God to receive their judgment. And look what it says in verse 12. "I saw the dead, both great and small, standing before God's throne, and the books were opened, including the book of life. And the dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books." So Revelation describes this scene where those who had not turned to God and accepted his forgiveness in their life are being judged for what they had done in this life, according to what is written in those books. And so you could assume that those who had done worse deeds or more deeds of sinfulness were going to be judged more severely. Now, don't misunderstand. Hell is a bad place, and you do not want to be there in any way, shape, or form. The Bible makes that very clear. But there do seem to be varying levels of severity of punishment within hell. So yes, the Bible does seem to indicate that there are greater levels of sin and lesser levels of sin. But here is the truth you need to understand. All sin, even small sin, separates us from God. Don't get the idea that because you haven't committed one of those big sins like murder or adultery or something like that, that somehow you're off the hook. Because while there are varying degrees of sin, there are not varying degrees of sinners. You either are a sinner or you aren't. You either have sin in your life, or the only other alternative is to be perfect. And I guarantee none of us are perfect. So no matter what you have done in this life, you might experience greater consequences in this life and even greater consequences in eternity. But if you have sinned even one time, you are going to be separated from God for all of eternity. That is what the Bible teaches. And that also teaches that there is only one solution to our problem of sin, whether that sin is great or small, and that solution is Jesus Christ and what he did for us on the cross. And so what the Bible says is this: you are either completely forgiven of all of your sin, sin, great and small, or you are completely guilty of your sin and rightly condemned for all of your sin. And what makes the difference is not how good you are, but whether or not you have trusted in Jesus alone for the forgiveness of your sin. So really, rather than worrying about how bad your sin is in God's eyes, the question is, have you been forgiven of your sin, whether it's big or little? Because again, even if it's little, the consequence is eternity in hell apart from God. So why don't you go ahead and take a minute and discuss these questions.